All right, we will kick off. Hi, my name's Julie Mackin, and it is my great pleasure tonight to be interviewing Professor Ian Lowe about his, as I was saying before, his small but perfectly formed book, Australia on the Brink, Avoiding Environmental Ruin. But before we do, we are really privileged to have Anne Polina with us tonight. And Anne, thank you very much for giving us an acknowledgement of country.
Yeah, no, thank you. Ngaju Ninilawalan Polina Ngayu Imarawaraman. So I'm just acknowledging in my language my name, but I also want to acknowledge our amazing country and our amazing nation and people. So I'm just acknowledging that as Indigenous people, we have not surrendered our sovereignty to this nation, and it is a world where we build reconciliation, peace, and security for all. So great opportunity to come together and listen to Ian Lowe today, but just acknowledging our country in this time of multiple crises, but on a journey to peace and security for all. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you. Um, yes, I'm excited about this, and judging by a number of people who registered, so are a lot of other people. I feel like I don't really need to introduce Ian, but if I don't, I'll get in really bad trouble. So I'm going to, even though I'm sure everyone is fully aware of Ian Lowe. But Professor Ian Lowe AO is an Australian academic and writer focused on environmental issues, a physics graduate. He's Emeritus Professor of Science, Technology and Society, former head of the School of Science at Griffith University. He's also an adjunct professor at Sunshine Coast University and Flinders University. He is an extraordinary author of many publications. And I'm really excited, Ian, to be talking about your book from the series of national interests, Australia on the Brink, Avoiding Environmental Ruin. Particularly now, as Anne said, that I think even the most kind of belligerent denialist amongst us would have to recognise that the weather and the climate is beginning to have its way with us. So it is timely. I have to say, I approached this book in kind of equal parts of despair, because along with everyone else, I am sure reading about the devastation that we're wreaking on this beautiful old country and climate change and what's headed our way is really hard yakka, actually. I find it extraordinarily depressing. So I always take a big, deep breath when reading it, but also equal parts hope, because the other part of the book is avoiding environmental ruin. So, Ian, if we could start off, if you would like to just give a really kind of brief history of how extensive the work that's gone into this is since, I don't know, what is it, 30 years ago?
Yes, 30 years ago, I chaired the advisory group that produced the first independent national report on the state of the environment. And in that, we said that Australia had a beautiful and unique environment, and much of it was in good condition by international standards. And some of our approaches are recognised internationally as models of good practice. But we also said that we had a few serious problems that needed to be addressed if we were to achieve our stated goal of developing sustainably. And I sometimes have to remind people that the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, in 1992 adopted a national strategy for ecologically sustainable development. So in principle, all of our governments are committed to the idea that we should develop sustainably. Now, we said in that report 30 years ago that the most serious problems were the loss of our unique biodiversity, the loss and degradation of productive rural land, the state of our inland rivers, especially the Murray-Darling system, the pressures on the coastal zone from increasing population and inappropriate development, and rapidly increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And all of the subsequent reports have said basically we have 5 serious problems: the loss of our unique biodiversity, the state of our inland rivers, accelerating climate change. And the fundamental problem, I think, is that governments, coalition or Labor, state or territory or Commonwealth, still behave as if looking after the environment were an optional extra, as long as it doesn't slow down economic growth. And so we are still losing biodiversity. Climate change is still accelerating. The Murray-Darling is still in desperate trouble. We are still losing and degrading productive land. The pressures on the coastal zone aren't going away. And I suppose the book is a cry of anger as much as despair at short-sighted decision makers who are still behaving as if managing our natural systems is not really a high priority.
Do you want to, and before I go on, I'll just say too that if people want to ask Ian any questions, there'll be time for that at the end. And if you want to put the questions in the chat, we'll just pick them up from there. So it's an extraordinary situation, really, isn't it? That you are describing, like this is our life support: clean water, air, a stable climate, biodiversity. It's like we are literally taking a hammer to our own head, the way we are destroying this, or not taking into account our destruction of this. Have you thoughts on, because the book is fantastic on really detailing exactly where we're up to in terms of that destruction. Have you thoughts on why we are apparently so belligerently destructive of our own life support?
Well, Australia is not unique. I was one of 15,000 scientists who endorsed the World Scientist's second warning to humanity in 2017, which is looking back at the World Scientist's first warning in 1992, 25 years of progress. And we said in that report that if you look at the global picture, there is one success story: the Montreal Protocol to reduce the release of ozone-depleting substances and the subsequent tightening of that at Stockholm and London has meant that the release of ozone-depleting substances now is about 20% of what it was at the peak. So the ozone layer is not getting any worse. And with the reasonable expectation is that it will gradually repair over the next 30 or 40 years. That's the one success story. Every other significant global indicator is going south. Freshwater per capita is down 25% in the last 25 years. The world fish catch is down 20%. We've lost 100 million hectares of forest. The number of ocean dead zones has doubled. Climate change is accelerating. And perhaps most worrying, if you look at species diversity, it's now down to something like 30% of what it was in 1970. So we're pulling random bricks out of the wall of life without really knowing what the consequences will be. What we do know is that if a species goes extinct, there's issues up and down the food chain. There's issues for the species that used to predate on it, for whom it was a food source, but there's also issues for the species on which it predated, which are likely to increase in number. So every species loss has effects up and down the food chain, and our science isn't good enough to predict what the consequences will be. But we know that if we keep pulling random bricks out of the wall of life, sooner or later whole sections of it are going to collapse. And there's a risk of non-linear change, a rapid and accelerating transition from one stable state to another.
What does that actually potentially, without wanting to be too morbid, but what does that actually look like? What does that actually look like?
Well, I mean, what we're seeing with climate change is more frequent and severe extreme events, which is exactly what the science was warning us in the 1980s would happen. And whether it's more severe floods or worse bushfire seasons, it's having an impact not just on the natural world, it's having an impact on our capacity to produce our food. It's having an impact on our ability to produce and supply clean drinking water to our settlements. And it's having economic implications. I just saw recently that the Queensland government has earmarked $73 million to repair public infrastructure from former tropical cyclone Alfred, which crossed the coast in March. That's just one event. But more generally, I remind people that as far back as the Kyoto Climate Change Conference in 1997, nearly 30 years ago, the one commercial sector that was saying this was a serious issue was the insurance industry. And they were pointing out then that they are commercial organisations, they're not charities. They have to set premiums that reflect the probability of paying out. And they were saying then that it was getting harder and harder to increase the premiums for property damage to reflect increasing costs. And they said then, 30 years ago, by the 2020s, probably large numbers of people would be unable to afford what is the commercially realistic insurance for their properties. And as a result, large numbers of people would be losing their properties uninsured. And that is something governments have to face up to, because you can't allow thousands of people, tens of thousands of people to lose their house and be unable to replace it because they couldn't afford the commercially realistic property insurance.
And of course, we're already seeing that in the northern rivers after the flooding. A lot, you can't build in certain areas there and you're uninsurable effectively. It's so exorbitant, the price.
Correct. And Lismore had in 1 year 3 events that historically would all have been 1 in 100-year floods. And the last one, the peak was 2 meters higher than the previous record. So the past is no longer an adequate guide to the future that climate change is bringing.
So, which raises an interesting, terrifying issue of, I guess, in my own mind, and I remember reporting on when I was at the Fin Review, there was the business roundtable that I think ACF was a part of in, was it 1996 or 1998, where businesses got together with ACF and other environmental groups and said, we need a really clear message on carbon pollution. And they were talking about this is a disaster and pointing up the Australian Insurance Group was a part of that, I think. They were pretty articulate about where we were headed. But I guess what is not talked about much is the cascading nature of these climate impacts. And, we're pretty good at bushfires. We're getting lots of practice with floods. But when we get the cascading nature of, as you said in Lismore, 3 events that only happen once every 100 years happening that year, and bushfires that are devastating now happening every 10 years rather than every 50 years, we're really beginning to digging into the bones of the country, really, aren't we?
That's absolutely right. And if you look at a problem like the effect of heat on the Great Barrier Reef, coral bleaching used to happen at long enough intervals that the coral had a chance to recover and be back in good shape before another bleaching episode happened. But when you're getting bleaching episodes, year after year, 3 years out of 4, the coral doesn't have a chance to recover. And the reef scientists that I know are very gloomy about the prospects. They're saying that on current trends, tropical reefs generally will be gone in 30 years' time. And I mean, that's not just the loss of a unique natural feature. The Great Barrier Reef is the main tourist attraction of Queensland, and tens of thousands of people go every year to see the Great Barrier Reef. And there are whole regions where the main economic activity is reef tourism, and people aren't going to come to look at a bleached reef.
Well, they'll come once, but probably never. They won't do a return trip, that's for sure.
And they'll tell their friends, "Don't waste your time." You know,
it's a
it's not what
graveyard.
it used to be. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the last election, and certainly the one before that, I think a lot of people had a lot of hope that with, Labor coming in, there was talk of fixing up the EPBC Act, which is a really important piece of infrastructure in terms of protecting the environment, and wrapping our heads around meaningful action for climate change. Here we are, 2026. How do you think we're headed? How do you think we're going?
Well, there's a fine line between pessimism and despair. It's very hard to be optimistic. I mean, if you think of the environmental legislation, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which the Howard government enacted in 1999, that gives the Commonwealth Minister the power to intervene and stop an inappropriate development which a state government has approved, which would put unreasonable pressure on a threatened species or an endangered ecological system. That power has been used twice, by Peter Garrett to stop the Traveston Crossing Dam and by Tanya Plibersek to stop the Toondah Harbour project in Moreton Bay, twice in 30 years. So simply having legislation which gives the Commonwealth Government the power to intervene doesn't necessarily produce any action. Somebody said that the Commonwealth Department of Environment has a branch that's called Assessment and Approvals, and that's at least truth in advertising because they assess proposals and approve them. That we're still very reluctant to stop economic activities, even if they have negative environmental impacts. What's interesting, I think, is that the community clearly understand the issue and the community want more action. The fact that seats like Tony Abbott's seat of Warringah or Josh Frydenberg's seat of Kooyong, which have been Liberal since time began, have been lost to independents whose platform was more action on climate change. It shows that the community understands the issue and is increasingly impatient with inaction and prepared to vote out senior ministers because they want more action on climate change. You would like to think that the government with a very large majority would have the courage to start taking serious action. But one of Minister Murray Watt's first actions was to extend the life of a gas project in Western Australia till something like somewhere in the 2070s. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the United Nations have both said, as far back as 2015, that to slow climate change and keep the planet habitable means we should not be approving any new fossil fuel projects, any new gas fields, any new coal mines, any new coal-fired power stations. But governments are still approving new gas and coal projects and extensions to existing ones, as if they didn't realise that they are sort of literally and metaphorically tipping petrol on the fire.
Just on this cheery subject, I noticed there's a question that is timely, where the UK have I think last week or the week before, put out a report talking about the probable ecological collapse. Is it a question? Is it just a statement of what the hell are we doing? We recently put out the impact of climate change on Australia, and it also had pretty devastating findings. Given this, and as you said, Ian, you've been writing on this in various ways for over 30 years, over 3 decades. I know the media have been reporting on this for over 30 years. It's kind of pretty clear to anyone actually who can read at the moment. And yet all the indicators are getting worse.
Yes.
And there seems to be no actual political will to do what needs to be done, which is we phase out coal and gas, we find a way to monetize massive rollout of wildlife corridors coast to coast. So we're putting in back in native forest, and all of that this is all big nation building stuff and a realignment of the economy. People have lost their seat, and as you pointed out, the Teals have got seats because the community want it. And yet Labor, even when Labor comes in, it's there. They campaign on this, they get into power, and it all disappears like water into sand. What do you think is stopping meaningful action on this? Because as you write in the book, we know how to avoid this. We actually do know what to do, but we're not doing it.
Yeah. I mean, there was a discussion at the Woodford Folk Festival a few years ago in which I was asked, if you could do one thing to change our political system, what would be the most urgent thing that should be done? And I said, I think the most urgent thing to do is to restrict or prohibit the right of private corporations to make donations to political parties. Now, at the local government level, we intervened to stop developers making donations to elected councillors because there was an obvious possibility of the system being corrupted. And I don't think there's any question that our political system is corrupted by allowing fossil fuel corporations to make donations to the major political parties. And they're backing both horses in a two-horse race. They donate both to Labor and to the coalition. And they must do it in expectation that they will get some benefit. I mean, otherwise they would have difficulty explaining to their shareholders why they are spending the company's money making donations to political parties. I think that even if there's not overt corruption, I think any minister would know that their party gets donations from interest groups and is reluctant to bite the hand that feeds them. And it doesn't just apply to environmental issues. I mean, we see timidity in the face of social problems like gambling. And it's our system isn't overtly corrupted. There aren't, as there were in the Bjelke-Petersen days in Queensland, people walking into minister's office with money in brown paper bags. But I think any outside observer would say that our political system is influenced by donations from private sector corporations, and it's very hard to see any instance of it being influenced for the better by the donations from corporations.
Yeah, I mean, even last week we had that. We had the story about how who's that horrible man, Steve Bannon, had worked with Clive Palmer to swing the election, and Clive Palmer's laughing, going, "I just put down 80 million and didn't get a seat, but I kept Bill Shorten out of power." I mean, this is just like if what's his face Bannon was a Russian agent, we'd be having a massive inquiry into that, but everyone's like, "Oh well, boys will be boys, I guess."
Yes.
So we get rid of political donations, but when we talked about a week ago and we went through some of the solutions you talk about in the book, all of which would help remediate where we're up to, you suggested that actually the solution was far more reframing how we understood our economic structure. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yes, I mean, it's an issue of priorities. Dr. Richard Eckersley tells a very nice anecdote. He says that he asks people, given what they know about their situation and the state of the world, is it their absolute highest priority to be twice as wealthy in 25 years' time and consuming twice as much? And he said that he hardly ever finds anyone who sees that as the top priority. a lot of people don't even see it as desirable to be twice as wealthy and consuming twice as much. But even those who see it desirable usually see it as one of a set of priorities like social cohesion, having a healthy family, there not being riots in the street and so on. So they don't see doubling their wealth in the next 25 years as the absolute highest priority. But if you analyse the actions of governments, state and territory, Commonwealth, Labor or coalition, they act as if the absolute highest priority is to have the economy growing at about 3% a year, which means doubling our wealth in the next 25 years. And social cohesion, the state of the environment, gets trampled in the rush to ensure that the economy is growing by 2 or 3% a year. There's no doubt that we could do better about keeping the environment in good shape if we were prepared to accept lower rates of growth, if we weren't obsessed with becoming wealthier and wealthier every year. And the same is true at the global level. I mean, I can't think of any government except perhaps Bhutan, any government which doesn't see a priority as economic growth. And since we know that the demands of the global population are causing damage to global systems and threatening our future, having a priority to increase those demands looks totally irrational.
So I often think, like, all right, imagine you and I are boss of the world for the day. It's going to be a big day and we're going to be very busy. But we can put in place structures that will tilt the course that we're on. When I think about steady state economics, and, you know, I know Michael Walker and others are working on degrowth economy, the part where I kind of trip over is trying to imagine what that would look like. And I often think the reason we can't get to where we imagine we want to go is because we can't imagine the process of getting there. Our entire capitalist system is built on competition. So the first thing that we would need to change, I guess, is moving from a competitive structure of society, economics and culture to a cooperative one. Because as I understand it, steady state economics really does need cooperation to flourish. So my question is, where is the work that goes into imagining a different future for ourselves along these lines? And how do we... Sorry. No,
there was a very interesting book written about 10 years ago by a Canadian academic called Peter Victor. He modelled alternative futures using the modelling tools that the Canadian Treasury used to look at the future of economic development in Canada. And he explored different possible futures. The first one he looked at was the business as usual approach, in which the economy continues to grow by 3% a year. And he found that that led to environmental collapse, serious problems, inability to produce food and drinking water and so on. He then looked at a future in which you stop growth immediately, and the result was economic and social upheaval, blood in the streets, because you can't stop the system literally overnight. He then explored a range of future models, and he decided that the key was to stabilise the population, because if the population is growing, there's inevitable political pressure to grow the economy so that people aren't worse off. So, and what he found is that if you stabilise the population, then you don't need to grow the economy. But what you do need to do is look seriously at reducing inequality by a fairer distribution of wealth. So it's possible to imagine a utopian future in which we have stabilized the population and can then move to a steady state economy with a fairer distribution. But that's much too difficult for most decision makers even to think about. I think even those who understand that growth can't go on forever want it to continue at least for their term of office, so that somebody else faces the difficulty of a future in which there isn't growth. But again, I mean, every elected politician promises to achieve stronger economic growth. And even those who aren't elected but rule by force generally feel they need to improve people's material standards or face insurrection. So the fundamental problem is our unwillingness to face the limits of natural systems. And politicians basically try to encourage us to believe in the fairy tale that growth can go on forever, even though we know that the current level of consumption is doing significant damage.
Yeah, I often think, how do we, in this instance, economic growth has a massive momentum behind it as a good news story. And the challenge for those who'd see it differently is for us to kind of destroy the social license of endless growth and challenge the notion of endless growth as being a good news story. You know, if I went to a doctor and she said to me, Julie, the bad news is within your lungs, you've got endless growth. This is a very bad thing. And I understand endless growth is not a good thing. Endless growth almost anywhere in the natural order is a sign of big trouble. But so it's us changing the story about it. I'm just seeing here too, sorry folks, I've just checked in with the questions. One of the questions asked by Jenny is, are we going to be able to feed the projected 10.3 billion people on the planet, or even the 8 billion that we have now, if we continue on in the direction that we're headed?
Well, it's been an extraordinary achievement in my lifetime that the human population has tripled, but there are more people well fed, fewer people starving today than there were when I was born. That we've done extraordinarily well to increase food production to cope with the increase in the human population. But that can't go on forever. And there's already signs that the reduction in the availability of water, for example, the damage done to natural cycles like the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle by the level of fertilizer use that's been required to increase food production to the current level, that basically the harsh truth is that if we don't stabilize the population in ways that are socially acceptable, it will be stabilized by our inability to provide food and water and shelter. And either for that reason or for other reasons, fighting amongst ourselves, which historically has been a significant way of curbing population growth. I think fundamentally, there are only three models that exist in the real world of species population in a closed system. The species can either increase to above the sustainable level, decline, increase again, decline again, and oscillate around a stable level. It can increase to a level which is sustainable and maintain that basically in perpetuity, or it can so grossly exceed the carrying capacity the population collapses and the species goes extinct. Now, it's obvious which of those three models we should be preferring. We should be aiming both at the national level and at the global level to stabilize the population at a level that can be sustainably supported. And if we don't, the inevitable result will be what William Rees has called a major population correction, which is a euphemistic way of saying large numbers of people will die.
I remember the first time I read something about climate change, I think it was 1994, and Jim Hansen had just written his observation about it, and it was so shocking at the time. But someone had said to him, where does this all end? You know, if we keep going in where we're headed, where does this all end? And he said, I think by the end of the next century, it ends with remnant tribes living at the North and the South Pole, trying to eke out an existence there, and everything in between will be gone. And the reporter looked at him and said, why on earth do you say that? And he said, because history tells us that when there is scarcity, human beings raid. And it was kind of a very chilling way of describing the kind of nature of us, I think, as a species, as part of nature, that none of us were used to seeing ourselves as.
Yes, Dr. Paul Raskin from the Telus Institute has argued that one credible future is what is called fortress world, in which the affluent countries try to build walls or fences to keep the millions out. And if you think about the issue of boat people, the fundamental reason why people are crowding onto leaky boats and braving shark-infested waters is that their lifestyle is very poor where it is. And while ever there are huge differences in material living standards between North America and Central America, between Europe and Africa, between Australia and Southeast Asia, there will be large numbers of people wanting to improve their lifestyle by moving to what they see as more affluent countries. And as those, I mean, Donald Trump trying to build a wall to keep people from Mexico out is a classic example of that sort of behaviour, that there's a feeling in the affluent countries that they need to pull up the drawbridge. And what was it John Howard said? We will decide who comes here. That some of those people are fleeing danger, they're seeking asylum, but large numbers of people are crowding onto boats and trying to get across the Mediterranean to Europe, or trying to get from France to the UK, but simply because they see a more secure and more affluent lifestyle and more opportunities for their children. And if we want to stop that sort of traffic, we really should take the idea of aid seriously. The best way to ensure people don't crowd onto leaky boats and brave shark-infested waters is to ensure that they have the basics of a civilized lifestyle where they are, and that they're not desperate enough to try and get to another continent.
Look, I'm just aware, and again, I'm sorry to do this to you, Anne, but I was just reading your comments, and I wonder, Anne, if you want to comment briefly on the, a proposition that First Nations people were living in a very steady state way before the colonisation of this country. And again, I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, Anne. I've just been...
I was just chuckling there. I think, leaders like myself today, what we're saying is that this is now about the reality of us as we collectively as Australians. So I tend not to sort of separate, Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, but this is the way we governed before settler society came. Polycentric governance, bottom-up, self-regulation, small family units of 75, and that's, that was sustainable. Someone said if you don't really keep a deep relationship with anyone more than that sort of number. So all of this is really what allowed us to sustain our lives in a sustainable way. But now the challenge is, how do we take that Indigenous wisdom into contemporary thinking, looking at governance and leadership? And we have seen as a nation over the past 20 years the amalgamation of local government and the need to come together for economy of scale and decision making. So my contemporary worldview is really about how do we set up regional government? how do we have better governance at the regional level where we all collectively bring our wisdom to the table to, one, understand cumulative impacts of development, but importantly, opportunities to work together in a climate, to have a climate chance and build that coalition. And really, when you look around our country now, that's what's happening. It's community that are building that sense of community spirit, the we, not the me. And so I think, there's a lots of structural and systemic things that we're talking about, but I think really, as I said, today coming on to this webinar and seeing what's happening in Sydney and what's happening in our nation, and where do we then start to mobilise the citizens and bring people with us, because what's happening is really not good governance and good government, because one of the things we do as Indigenous people is we come from a holistic world. So we don't separate everything, land, water, people, nature. Everything is intrinsically entwined. And I think we need to find better ways of working together at the regional level. And really what we're doing at the moment is we're farming people in terms of the sustainability of our population in this nation. And therefore that then has a catalytic effect on more production, more production, more production. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne.
Can I just enlarge on that? I remind people that the first Australians worked out over tens of thousands of years how to live within the limits of the natural systems of this harsh and unforgiving continent. And they embodied that knowledge, not just in custom and practice, but in their system of laws. They had a system of laws that allowed each of those nations to live within the limits of its natural systems.
That's exactly right, Ian. And that's why I write a lot about first law. But first law is about, these are the values, the ethics, the virtues that we agree to live as civilized people in a civil society. We self-regulate our behaviour. And so that first law is all about. It's a philosophical principle of how we live, human to human, human to non-human. So exactly right. This is the story about how, and sorry to take the floor, but how I published a paper called How Indigenous Wisdom Can Save Humanity. There is knowledge and wisdom here that we really need to be embedding into the strategies that we're employing. And so when I look across the room and see lots of my colleagues, I know we're working really hard to do that, but we really need to make our governments accountable. One of the things I mentioned in terms of climate change, climate crisis, whatever we want to call it, is the end point to the politics of economic and production. And just the other day, 22 years of giving away oil and gas for free, no export tax. And now we've got this illusion in our nation where we have this so-called crisis cost of living. There's plenty of money. It's just not trickling down to our people and our social good to ensure security and peace for all of us, but also to sustain our social goods. Hospitals are imploding. GPs are walking away from practice, all of these things. So I think this is a very good talk today in terms of, it's not just about climate change, it's waking up the consciousness of our people to where we sit as fellow citizens and as global citizens, and our duty of care to do the right thing by all of us, but importantly, future generations not born yet.
Beautiful.
Agreed. And there's an example of what can be done. I'm on the Noosa Biosphere Reserve Foundation, and the UNESCO Biosphere Program is one in which regions like Noosa or the Sunshine Coast agree that they will try to manage their social and economic development in ways that maintain the integrity of the natural systems. And Noosa has to go back to UNESCO to get its koala stamp renewed in 2027. It has to demonstrate that its pattern of social and economic development is not damaging the integrity of the natural systems. Now, it seems to me that we shouldn't just regard places like Noosa as strange, isolated examples of people living within the limits of natural systems. They are just doing what we should all be doing if we took seriously the COAG Declaration in 1992, that we would manage our pattern of development in a way that did not reduce opportunities for future generations and that strived for equity within and between generations. Those are simple moral principles that all our decision makers should be signed up to.
Two things, Ian. First, it would be really great if you could put in the chat the name of that thing that you were just describing then, because I'd really love to have a look at it, and I'm sure others would too. I'm thinking that might help Yas. Not quite Noosa, but certainly good.
Yeah.
And we've got a question here too about, Ian, what do you know of the climate security report that was kept secret until last year and then only a partial release was made? Do you know anything about that? Can comment on that?
Yes, I mean, there's a group of former military people who have made a public statement that the greatest threat to our security is not any military threat, it's climate change. That climate change is now the biggest single threat to our security as a community in Australia. And there was a government report which was kept under wraps because it reflects very badly on government's priorities. That they think that it's worth spending 368 billion on nuclear submarines that we might never see, whereas much smaller amounts could be used to maintain our security against the threat of climate change, to mitigate emissions and to set in place adaptation measures for the changes that we can't stop because of the very long time lags in the system. So the British report just released was also saying that there's a credible risk of systems collapsing, and that means that trying to avoid collapse should be a high priority. And that there's a much more serious risk to the community from climate change and from loss of biodiversity than anything you could imagine would be stopped by 5 or 6 nuclear submarines.
And yet, from the looks of things, England is responding to that report in the same way Australia did by going, oh dear. That's about it.
Yes. Shock horror. Yeah.
It is amazing, isn't it? Who was it who said, our response to climate change is the longest suicide note ever written in the world? Because we keep getting these huge, should be alarming climate events and smacks over the head from reality, and it feels like it is so difficult to get a coordinated, compelling, community-wide response that would drive politics before it and bring about change. And on that, I noticed there's a question here for you, Ian, saying, Ian, do you aim to inspire a vocal, widespread campaign on these issues?
And the answer is absolutely. I mean, I've been trying to inspire campaigns to bring about fundamental change for decades, because if you know you're booked on the Titanic and you can see that you're heading for the iceberg, it's only responsible to be trying to persuade the captain to steer in a different direction. And if the captain is resistant, it's reasonable to suggest you should be organising a mutiny. That I used to say to my students that if a visitor from another galaxy happened on our civilization, they'd be puzzled to find that there are endless reports and documents about sustainable development. Yet almost every country in the world is developing in a way that is palpably not sustainable. And they would find it puzzling in the extreme that our decision makers seem not to realise that climate change and loss of biodiversity, degradation of productive rural land, the state of our inland rivers, these are serious threats to our future as a civilization, and they should be a much higher priority.
There's one more question, Ian, and I'm aware we're quickly running out of time. And I'm going to be a bit cheeky here. I'm going to ask you the question first, and then having worked for Greenpeace, I'm going to give a red hot go at answering it myself.
Right.
But so the question is, why aren't organisations like ACF, WWF, etc., linking up with Get Up and Greenpeace to organise a national campaign? So if you want to have the first run at that, Ian, it would be terrific.
Very good question. I mean, when I was president of ACF, where we put out reports about the need to move beyond growth, the need to have a vision of a sustainable future, but that didn't get any political traction. And I think those conservation organisations like ACF and Greenpeace and WWF have more or less given up on the 1980s model of taking your briefcase to Canberra to talk in a civilized manner to decision makers in the hope of persuading them to do something different. And I think they're now all directly or indirectly engaged in changing the community mood to which politicians respond. And I think the fact that senior politicians are being voted out in favour of teal independents or green candidates shows that that is working. But it's very hard to be optimistic that it's working quickly enough and fundamentally enough.
Yeah, I must say my response to that would be that to get a shift at the speed and depth that we need this shift to happen, and to have these discussions on, you know, really basic stuff like, yes, make polluters pay tax, yes, get political lobbyists out of Canberra full stop, and yes, let's make every election campaign a publicly funded campaign so we do away with corruption. To get that happening, we would really need all of those environmental NGOs who, for the record, make a great deal of money to agree to a coordinated campaign to run exactly that. It would have to be a campaign that was very ambitious and simple, and here are the three things everyone in Australia needs to do to make this happen. And unfortunately, the thing that mitigates against that is all of those organisations are highly protective of their funding base, and which makes cooperating on these huge campaigns where all of it is held in common between all of them.
Yes.
They don't have the leadership that would say we need to put aside our own small financial interests for the greater good.
Yeah.
And that same story could be replicated across Australia in federal, state politics. It is so difficult for us to put aside our own petty kind of story to link up with other like-minded people. I think, you know, Anne, you touched on it, and you always talk about it. That is the challenge for us, to see in each other, actually, our hope is in each other. Our strength is with each other. And we need to find ways of being in relationship with one another again that drives this forward. Because we will act when we feel safe with each other. It's that old story of solidarity. Solidarity is itself the grace that makes this kind of thing happen. I
Agreed. It has to be based on a vision of a better future. I think it was Lester Thurow said, it's hard to tell people that the party's over if they haven't got to the bar yet. We need to be telling people about a better party, because it's not going to run out of food and drink. It's not going to leave people with a nasty hangover. You won't have the neighbours throwing rocks on the roof because they'll be invited in and they'll be part of it. That there's not much mileage in telling people to turn off the lights and freeze in the dark. What has potential mileage is spelling out a vision of a better future, a future where we are living comfortably within the limits of natural systems, and where our grandchildren won't be cursing us for our short-sightedness and greed.
Yeah. Okay. And thank you so much for what a great evening's discussion, and thank all of you, and particularly Anne. I'm sorry I kept dropping you in it. It is just, you know, it is an antidote to despair, knowing that we can turn up, even if it's just on the computer, and see like-minded people, and to remind ourselves that we're actually all pulling in the same direction. So I'm deeply grateful for your company tonight. And the book is Ian Lowe, Australia on the Brink, Avoiding Environmental Ruin. It's an hour's read. You get on in Sydney. By the time you land in Brisbane, you've read it. Thanks, everyone, and good night.
Thanks, Julie.